Hello, 115 students. This is my recording for the sort of extra optional lab 11 on timers and events. Um, I'm not going to go through all of the detailed parts of the lab. I'm just going to go through some of the basics, and I will let you explore the details on your own. So let's get started. Um, the overview of this lab, the whole point of this, is basically to think about how can we dynamically modify the page using JavaScript and do some more advanced things like animations that change over time. And this is useful for your own pages, but the motivation that we're going to use for this lab is imagine that you are in your dorm with your roommate. I know you're not in that situation right now. But imagine that you're in that situation and that your roommate leaves their computer unattended and goes out for 5 or 10 minutes and then comes back. And in the meantime, you take the liberty of going to the computer. You see that they have a web browser open and a web page is loaded. And you open up the console, type in some commands, and then close the console and pretend that you have not touched their computer. And when they come back, what interesting things could you do to change the behavior of a web page that you don't directly control, but you're modifying through the console? So in this lab, we're not going to be creating any HTML files or any really JavaScript files that we're going to attach anywhere. We're just going to be copy and pasting code into the console of other web pages. So let me get to the first part of the lab. And we need to be able to sort of use JavaScript to get at and change web pages in order to do anything interesting or fun. For this example in the lab, I'm going to run through with google.com as the page that we'll be modifying. How would we do some of these things, like change the background color of the page, right? Well, if I open up the console here, in JavaScript, right, I can type commands, and we know that document.getElementById is a way that we can grab elements out of the page if they have ID values. But we have no idea what the code of google.com looks like. Now, we could use the inspector, right, over here to figure out what's in here, but there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm just going to start with a simple example, though. Every web page has a body, and if we want to refer to the whole body, I can say document.body. Okay, and now I have that body. If I hit enter, it'll say, hey, that's a body element, and it shows me, it highlights, that's the whole page. If I want to do something simple like make the background blue, right, I can say document.body, and then every HTML element has an attribute called style, so .style, which contains all of its CSS properties. And so I can modify those. I can say document.body.style, .background color. And notice that in the CSS, we would have referred to this as background dash color, but instead of the dash, we use a capital C and get rid of that dash. So if I say equals blue, I say I want to put some new information, move it across this equals sign from right to left, put it into this, this sort of very specific part, the background color part of the style, part of the body, part of the document. And there we do. We see it happen, right? We see the background change to blue. If I get rid of the console now, we can see the whole background is blue. Now notice that anything I type in the console here to modify the page, nobody else in the world is going to see it, right? And even if I open up the same web page in a new tab, it's only this particular tab of this particular browser on this particular computer that those changes apply to. And even in this tab, if I were to just refresh the page, we're going to get a fresh copy of the HTML, fresh copy of the CSS. All the changes we applied go away. So in that sense, it's good because the changes that we're making are not really destructive in the long term. Although we do have to be careful. You can imagine that if you do a prank like this and somebody's filling out a really long form and they get to the end and something you've done messes up the submission of that form, then that could be destructive in a way. So if you are going to use this stuff to do pranks, be mindful of the impact that it has and make sure you're doing something that is fun but not going to be taken the wrong way. All right, so basic application of JavaScript to change styles, right, is this document.body.style.background color equals blue. And we can change different aspects of the style, right? We could say like document.body.style.transform equals rotate 90 degrees. I think that's the syntax, but I can never remember it. Let's try it. There we go. I have turned Google sideways. And we can scroll sideways, up and down. We can type something into the search field. I'm typing here, and it types sideways. Gonna refresh the page to get rid of that, right? But we can modify all sorts of different attributes of the style to do interesting things. All right. There's some examples here of different ways that you can modify things. Feel free to try them out. The important part of this, though, is that I have done the hard work of figuring out how could we get at some of the important fields on Google.com. And if you wanted to apply these kind of pranks to Facebook or Twitter or some other website, you would have to do this work too, which is to find in the page where the element you want is, right? And so on Google, we can use the inspector to do that. I can say, okay, I want to mess with this search input. I'm going to right-click on it and do inspect element. And if you're lucky, the element that you hit will have an ID value. Unfortunately, the search element on Google does not. It has a bunch of different attributes, but none of them is an ID attribute. So what we're going to do is instead use something called query selector. And it lets us do CSS style queries. This is an advanced CSS query that we haven't even seen in CSS before. But it's a way of saying, hey, I want input, so I want this type of HTML tag, and I want it to have this attribute, and I want the attribute to have this value. So type equals text. And it turns out that on Google, the only input attribute with type equals text is this search field. So if we just select that using query selector, that will be our search. And if I copy this code, I paste it over here in my console, and we look at the search variable, it's this input, and I can see if I mouse over it that that's the part of the page, right? Sorry, I'm on the selecting elements now. So that's how you get the search element of Google. This is another one where we can get the button. It turns out that there are two buttons called Google Search, right? This is what I'm selecting here. And so you use query selector all, which returns an array of elements. And we haven't really talked about arrays. But one thing you can do with them is use these square brackets to pull something out of them. So this bracket 1 bracket is telling me get the second thing. I know the 1 seems like it might be the first thing, but it's the second thing in that array. So you don't really have to understand this code in detail. All you need to know is that it grabs the button from the page, which is, just get rid of the inspector for a second. It's this Google search button here that I'm going to grab with that code. So if I paste that code here and I type button and I mouse over, right, it shows me that that's the element that's selected. Can move this in a little bit. All right, it shows me that's the button that's selected. So with that in mind, we can then modify the styles of these things, or later on in the lab, we'll be attaching different functions to activate when they're interacted with. Okay, just an aside here, there's some text or some code in this lab that we want you to copy paste into different places. It is useful to just open up an Atom window, and I have that open over here. Here's the search and the button that you just saw, where we take some code and we just sort of keep it here as like a working place, and then we can copy paste it from Atom into Google and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, we can change it in Atom until we think it will work, and then copy paste it again, so that we don't lose progress if we're just typing all our code directly into the console. Okay, so we've selected some elements of the page that we're interested in. Let's talk about timers for a moment. And so we've talked about document and document.getElementById. There's another sort of high-level variable floating around in JavaScript called window. And it refers not to the HTML document that's loaded, but to the actual browser window that the user is using. We can use the window to do things like change the title that appears in the tab that they're seeing. Or even we can use it to navigate to a different URL. But for our purposes right now, the function we're interested in is called setTimeout. And so this is a function that simply sets a timer. And when that timer is expired, it calls a function that we tell it to call. So here's a very simple example of that. I define a function called sayHi. It takes no parameters, has no return value. All it does is pop up an alert, right? So if I were to go ahead and define this function, I could do this on any page, but I'll do it on google.com. And then if I call that function, I say sayHi, right? Call that function with parentheses. It pops up an alert. Okay, that's not that useful. I could have just called the alert function, which already exists, right? But if I do this, if I say window.setTimeout, so set a timer, and then the first argument is the function we're going to call. So when this timer is ready, we're going to call that sayHi function I just defined. And then the second argument is the number of milliseconds before the timer expires. So if I do that here, nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens, hi, right? Do that again, 1,000, 2, 1,000, oh, there's my timer, right? So 2,000 milliseconds is 200 seconds, or sorry, it's 2 seconds, do math. So what this is saying is, okay, after 2 seconds, call that function. Now that might not seem like a big deal, but we can use it to do some interesting things. So a looping timer is when you set up a function which the last thing in that function sets up a timer to call that function again. And so this is a function that will be coming back again and again and again and again, and as long as the page is alive, that code will keep happening. So I have a function called annoying that says alert hey. And then it says set a timer and call annoying again in 1 second, right? Okay, so if I define this function over here on Google, it says, great, you've defined the function, let me know what you want to call it, right? And if I call it, it says, pops up hey. Say, all right, hey, fine, good, okay. 1 second later, pops up hey again, right? Because as soon as this function gets to that last step of the function, it says, okay, set a timer. So when I click OK here, it's going to say, okay, we're done with the alert. Now I'm going to set a timer. 1 second later, hey, okay, hey, okay, right? So this is indeed annoying, and you can see that my browser is actually aware of the fact that this is annoying and has a little button that I can check to prevent the page from creating any additional dialogue. I can also, if I'm stuck in this loop, simply refresh the page, right? Because that gets rid of any functions I've defined in the console, any code that's running, it resets everything. Okay. So that's something you can do, and you can imagine doing that not to just pop up annoying alerts, but to have something that's modifying the behavior of the page continuously, right? And so here's an example of that you can try on your own. Every 500 milliseconds, replace the search field contents of Google search with the string ha ha ha. If you do this, you'll find that it is indeed pretty frustrating, because as soon as you start trying to type something to search, right, that's what you're there for on Google, whatever you typed will just get thrown away and replaced with ha ha ha. And even if you try to start deleting it, whatever you deleted still get thrown away, replaced with ha ha ha. Okay, so we could also use this power for better purposes, right? We could have something like, you can imagine a JavaScript clock, where we have hours and minutes and maybe seconds, and maybe every second we call a function that updates the number of seconds to be the correct number of seconds for the current time. Okay, here's a more advanced example of sort of ping pong, is two functions that go back and forth. So instead of always doing the same thing in a loop, we're going to have one function that sets a timer to call a second function. And then the second function sets a timer to call the first function. And so we still have this looping behavior where back and forth and back and forth and back and forth we continue. But we have two different things happening. And so this example, I'm just going to copy paste the whole example. It uses this button variable, so I'm going to need to make sure I establish that first. Let me go over to my atom, grab this button, copy that, paste it over here. Okay, I have my button variable, and I'm going to copy this now and paste it over here. Okay, and look at what's happening here in the middle. See, the Google search is jumping up and down and up and down and up and down every second. And so what I've done here is I've said, okay, nudge up is a function. It takes one parameter, the target element, says take that target element, change the style, change the display part of the style to be inline dash block. I'm doing this because depending on what element you use, the top margin might not have any effect, and I want to make sure it will have an effect. And then I say, okay, take that same element, take the style and the top margin, and change it to 0 points. So that'll be no top margin. And then the last thing in nudge up is to say, now we're going to set a timer for 1 second. We're going to call nudge down. And then any extra arguments that you pass into the set timeout function will be passed straight into the other function that you're calling after the timeout is done. So this target element is going to get passed into the nudge down function as the first argument. And so the target element is sort of being passed back and forth by these two players in this game. Nudge down, well, it looks like exactly the same code except we set the top margin to 24 points. And so that's what you see happening here is the top margin goes up to 24, down to 0, up to 24, down to 0, up to 24, down to 0. And that pushes the button up and down on the page. We can use this kind of thing for some very complicated JavaScript animations. There's also ways to do animations with just CSS or with a mixture of CSS and JavaScript. But these arbitrary JavaScript animations are sort of the most powerful because you can do anything you want as long as you know what style properties you want to modify. And you can get complicated about the timing of things if you want. Okay, so that is all I had to say about timers. There's some example here. So this is two functions that nudge something up and down. Could you create two functions that have an element sort of rotate and wiggle back and forth instead? Let me talk now about events. By the way, this outline that I'm using where I'm highlighting the next thing each time, that was created using these same techniques. So I have a JavaScript event listener, which is saying whenever you click on this page, highlight the next thing. All right, so events. We've talked about this on-click attribute of buttons, right? To attach a function to say, when you click this button, this function runs. That's great, but we can do a lot more than that. It turns out that JavaScript has a function called add event listener. And if we call that function after a period, after any kind of JavaScript element, in this example, we're just doing the body of the page, but you could select a particular button or search field and attach an event to that element. We give it the name of the event that we want to track. So if the on-click is the attribute, we get rid of the on part, and click is the event name. And there's a reference here that talks about a lot of different events, but mouse over and key up are some other important events. So we say, hey, this is the event I want you to listen to. When that event happens, here's the function I want you to call, right? And so function oops is defined up here. And what oops does is it says document.body.innerHTML equals an empty string. So if we run this code, we say, here's my function. When you click on the body, I want you to call it. Let's see what happens. Here's Google. I'm going to open up the console again. We're still moving up and down. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page to get rid of that. And I'm going to paste this code. And then I told the function to trigger when I click on the page. So, all right, I'm going to click on the page, and whoop, there goes the page, right? Because what I said was I want you to take the body, the whole body of the page, the whole HTML code that's there, replace it with nothing. And so this is, like I mentioned earlier, could be a little bit of a destructive prank if that's what you choose to do. So be careful about that, right? Do something that that won't cause actual problems for somebody. You can imagine if you do that to their Gmail page and then they're typing a long email and then they click and the whole thing goes away, they might be pretty sad. Okay, so that's the idea of events. And you can use this reference to figure out what kind of events there are. And here's a challenge that you could undertake, right? So create a function that adds a hyphen to the Google search input box every time the user types a character. We can use the key up event trigger. So we can do add event listener with key up as the string. And then I already showed you how to select that search input box. We have that code from before. That is basically the overview of events. I'll show you one example of events, which is not this. I have the code over here in Atom. I'm going to go ahead and copy paste all of this. So this is a function. It's called dodge the mouse. It takes the top margin of the button and turns it into an integer. And then says if that integer is not a number or that integer is less than 20, we're going to set the margin to 40 points. Otherwise, we're going to set the margin to 0 points. So in other words, if the margin is large, we're going to make it 0. If the margin is small, we're going to make it 40. So the margin is going to go either up or down, depending on the current value of the margin. And finally, we're going to take that margin value and put it back into that button.style.margin top. So why is this called dodge the mouse? Well, we're about to find out. Because we're going to attach it in the mouse over event on the button. So we're going to say when the mouse enters that button, when the mouse sort of comes into the inside of that button, as soon as that happens, I want you to call this function. Okay. And so let's go ahead and see what that does. Go on Google, and I'm just going to refresh the page real quick, and then paste that code in here. Then get rid of my inspector for a second. All right, and so here's this Google search button. Oh, I triggered it there. Notice I moved my mouse near it, but not on it. I moved it on it for a second. And our function is going to be called when I move the mouse over the button. So I'm going to try to click on the button, and oh, as soon as the mouse was over the button, it moved the button down, right? It said the margin is 0. I'm going to make it 40. So, okay, I'll move my mouse to find the button again, and oh, as soon as my mouse entered the field of the button, it set the margin back to 0. And so I cannot click on this button because every time I move the mouse over it before I have a chance to click, the margin changes so the mouse isn't over the button anymore. And so this is another sort of fun trick to play. It is very frustrating, but of course, not necessarily. There are ways to get around it, right? You could use the tab key to switch focus to the button, and then use enter in order to go ahead and, or maybe spacebar to activate the button. But that's an example of the power of events, right? So I have attached a certain function that modifies the page to this function shall happen whenever the mouse enters an element. And now I have this sort of weird behavior. So I encourage you to build some of your own custom code. And it can be like I've been doing sort of for the purposes of sort of fun pranks, or, you know, it could be something that's more like something pretty, right? Like you could do text that keeps changing color every second, or changing color every time you type a letter. And there's lots of things you can do with these two things, with timers and events. But that is it for me for this video. I hope you have fun playing around with this stuff, and as always, feel free to drop by my office hours and ask me questions about it. Thank you for watching.